All right, well, it is 2 on the dot, so we might as well get started. My name's Caleb. I've been with HiPoCON for it'll be 6 years in January. I've been in IT for coming on 20 years now. When I first started my career, I absolutely hated backup. I hated DR. It was the thing I didn't want to talk about. It was the thing I didn't want to deal with because it was ugly, it was messy, and it wasn't glamorous. Now guess what? I specialize in it. So what I wanted to do today is talk through some strategies. Some of this might be new information. Some of this might be information you guys already know. I'll try not to make it too boring. I prefer to have a dialogue. I don't like to monologue. So if you guys have questions or you want to explore anything further, feel free to say something. There's going to be some topics that you probably already know, some things that you may not have known, or maybe something that you want to dig into a bit further. I think that backup and disaster recovery, business continuity specifically, are very critical to business, especially as we forge our way into the future, as we look at what happens and what the repercussions are of cyber incidents, ransomware attacks, etc. The need for solid backup solutions, business continuity solutions, is more critical than ever. And it doesn't have to be all that complicated. Really, at the end of the day, it comes down to risk, and we'll explore that a bit. But that said, we're going to talk through some key differences between backup and disaster recovery. Through the conversations I've had through the years, there have been some, I don't want to say confusion, that's probably not quite the right word, but there's been some maybe misunderstanding as the difference between backup and disaster recovery. I've had people tell me that I have backup, I don't need disaster recovery. Backup is my disaster recovery. And I want to differentiate those two. And I don't know if it's just me being me, but the reason I like to decouple backup from disaster recovery is because they are, in effect, two separate processes, if we can call them that. Backup is the backup of data. Yes, it can be used for disaster recovery. You can recover VMs from it. You can recover infrastructure from it. But where I differentiate backup and disaster recovery is something that's warmer, that's hotter. It's standby replicas. It's ready to be spun up. You may already have a network built. You may have connectivity to another location, be it in the cloud, be it another one of your physical locations. But at the end of the day, you have another location to fail over to. With disaster recovery, you're going to definitely spend some more time thinking through, how do I get my users to my data, or how do I get my data to my users? Am I going to be using an SSL VPN, which I know we had a breakout session about SSL VPN today. Who was in the SSE breakout? A little bit of a different thought process for bringing data to your users or users to your data. Historically, we would have said SSL VPN, but SSL VPNs have had some problems of late. But as we think through disaster recovery versus backup, it's going to come down to risk. We'll get into that. I've kind of alluded to that twice. A couple bullets here, but disaster recovery is going to include testing of that solution, spinning up that data, spinning up those resources, making sure that they're available, and then running through the steps that it would require to bring your users to the data, or your data to the users. I should probably clarify that. I keep saying that in two different ways, and the reason I do is because depending on the applications that you use, you may want to bring your users to your data with a terminal server, rather than trying to bring your application data to your users. Many applications don't like or transport well over latent connections, be they SSL VPN, IPsec tunnels, etc. So there is always the question, do you need to bring your users to your data, or do you need to bring your data to your users? If you have latent applications, specifically things with fairly large backends or databases, it's often better to bring your users to your data with a terminal server or something like that in the event of a disaster. There are ways that you can bring, I guess, what I'm trying to say is In a disaster, more than likely, unless you have got some fairly robust infrastructure to another location, you're probably going to be accessing that data over a latent connection. So how does your application, how does your production data perform over latent connections? Do you need to plan or make some adjustments for how you access that data? So that's kind of what I mean by the difference between bringing your users to your data, terminal server, something similar, or bringing your data to your users, accessing that data over a latent connection. Let's see here, did I cover these? I think I covered these. I'll just run through these really quick. But backups focus on data preservation while disaster recovery emphasizes system restoration. Disaster recovery would include bringing your production systems online, bringing your basically everything in production back online, maybe in a degraded state, but still back online. Backups can be executed frequently, whereas disaster recovery plans are less frequent but critical. You should be testing your backups fairly regularly. What is fairly regularly? We'll get to that probably when I get to risk, but depending on your organization's risk, you may want to test it more or less frequently, or appetite for risk, excuse me. Comprehensive planning, I did touch on that a bit. You do need to think through, again, how we're getting to the data, where we're going to put it, what is our fail-back plan, et cetera. There's a lot more that goes into disaster recovery. So I'm going to touch on here in a second, apparently. I forgot I had one more slide here. We're going to touch on a good, better, best strategy from things that I've seen in the real world and talking with some of you, some of your peers, some of your counterparts. I wanted to define some terms. This is the slide. I think I was telling Brandon I was scared of this slide a little bit because I don't want to tell you something that you already know, but I'm going to run through these. RTO is recovery time objective. That's the maximum allowed downtime after disruption. I've seen a lot of people get RTO and RPO mixed up, which is why I have RPO next. RPO is a recovery point objective, and that defines how many times data is captured throughout a day or a period of time. Operational restore window, I'm going to give these guys over here in the corner credit for this one, because the operational restore window, I think, is something that Veeam popularized. And that is the amount of time that, oops, I wrote that wrong. But that operational restore window is the amount of time that data can live locally in a more hot, recoverable storage. Typically, when I'm working to build out a solution for a customer, I will define an operational restore window as the amount of time that you want data to reside, probably just in warmer storage, and usually in your own data center. That's the I nuked the shared folder. I need to recover it quickly. I need to pull 2 terabytes out of my backups and put it back on a file server. That isn't going to take 5 minutes it's not going to take 5 minutes locally either, but it's not going to take 5 minutes out of the cloud. So I try to define operational restore window as the amount of time that you will allow data to go missing effectively, where you'd want to recover it from hotter storage. These metrics will help you plan your recovery strategies. They'll help inform you for risk and how much risk appetite you guys have. And then balancing all 3 of those will help you figure out where you want to be as far as how warm you want your backups, your disaster recovery, or your plans to be. So let's talk about. Oops. I think I just talked through this one. I apologize. I'm kind of running over myself. When you're thinking of a recovery time objective, how are your users going to access the data? Is there a mobile workforce? Are you going to send people home? Are they going to work from personal devices? Do you have a warehouse of laptops or workstations that you can assign? Are they going into a hotel and a conference room or conference center where they're all going to work together? Do you know how your users are going to continue working if your environment is a total loss? The other piece that goes along with this is oftentimes in a cyber incident, workstations and end user devices are evidence. That means that your users may not necessarily get to have access to them until forensics is completed. So what is the plan to having those users access that data throughout that period? Is that going to be, like I said, a warehouse of laptops? Is that going to be, why am I blanking? I totally blanked, I apologize. Virtual desktops of some sort. Are you going to build site-to-site VPNs so that your remote locations can access your DR site? Bring your users to your data or data to your users? I'm going to harp on that one, apparently. Apologize. Are we aware of what our application latency tolerance is? Are there implications for spinning up applications on non-native hardware? And what I mean by that is if the MAC address changes this is typically what I see, if a MAC address changes of a virtual machine, will the software run? Will the software be licensed anymore? Is there a USB dongle that licenses your software that needs to be transported somewhere else as well, so that you can actually get back in business? All those are going to inform your backup versus disaster recovery plan, and depending on what your recovery time objective, that's where we're headed next. There is a large cost the closer you get to zero recovery time, the cost goes up dramatically. That means that you have to have nearly one-to-one compute, nearly one-to-one memory. Everything needs to be damn near one-to-one for your applications to work as they would in production. If you're looking to have a highly available or redundant build, that means that you're going to have redundancy from a networking perspective, hardware perspective, et cetera. So basically what I'm getting at is if you're going to have like a geo-redundant and resilient infrastructure, which I don't think Dwayne's in here. Our CTO actually had built one of those. It was pretty impressive to see how that works. Most people can't afford that. Most people won't necessarily have a geo-redundant and resilient network where they can actually just instantly fail over to another location, nobody knows anything. That would be zero recovery time objective. The further we get away from zero, the cheaper it gets, which is where we get into backup. Backup is about as cheap as it gets, whereas real-time resilient, geo-redundant resilient networks are the most expensive. So we need to, as we go through this process, as we think for each of your organizations, we need to think through what kind of risk does my organization tolerate? What kind of downtime does my organization tolerate? How much does an outage cost us from a reputation perspective, from a dollars and cents perspective, from revenue, et cetera? Good. Now we're finally to the good, better, best part. That was a long intro. Good is backup plus cloud offsites or air gap. That is about as basic as backups can get, in my opinion. That means that you are backing up your data regularly to a local appliance. I was just actually having this conversation with Kamal. You're backing up your data to a local appliance, and you're replicating that offsite. In an ideal world, and what I would prefer to see, is both of those locations be immutable. That means that if a threat actor was able to get access to your environment, they cannot attack your backups. That is typically what malicious actors start with, is they'll try to find backups and destroy those. If your local data is immutable, as is your cloud data, you are in very good shape. I've actually seen, being in our incident response team, I've seen a number of times where both sides of this, local repositories are not immutable, backups are destroyed, and I've also seen where local repositories are immutable. Recently, I have seen where, this was a very sophisticated attack, but recently I have seen where keys to a S3 bucket were stolen as part of the attack, and I did actually get to see immutability work in real time. I actually have logs of a threat actor trying to delete data in the cloud. They were unsuccessful, thankfully, we were able to do a full recovery. But my point simply being that in that scenario, local backups were not encrypted, they were not immutable, they were destroyed, and the threat actor managed to steal keys and try to attack the immutable bucket off-site. Fortunately, that one was immutable. Therefore, in my opinion, it is best to have immutability in both locations. Backups are ideal for organizations with less recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives because they are fairly low in cost. Just keep in mind that your recovery time objective is going to be the amount of time it takes to pull all of that data out of wherever it's stored and put it back into hardware that can be spun up. So that's the cheapest way to do it. The cloud is getting cheaper. It seems like it's a race to zero from a storage perspective. So that's good news for us as consumers, but it is, I don't know where I was going with that. It is just good news for us as consumers. Moving on, we have backup with a cold site and cloud recovery. This is typically where you will take backups. So it's really building on what we were just talking about with backup, but adding a component where you have the ability to convert backups that are stored in the cloud to virtual machines, either in Azure, in Amazon, in GCP, or Google Cloud, and convert those backups into fully running virtual machines. This is fairly low in cost because you're not actually paying for those replicas or that hardware, it is hardware to sit there and act as a machine ready to be spun up. So the cost is lower than where we're going, but it does have some recovery time. That means that you have to take those backups from their bucket or wherever they're stored in the cloud, and then run those over to a disk that can be mounted to a virtual machine and spun up. How much time does it take to pull that data out of your backups to convert it to a disk? That is something that you need to be aware of because that's going to inform your risk appetite. If that is, I've got 12 terabytes of data and it's going to take me 2 weeks to convert that data from where it sits as a backup to a virtual machine, that might be a bridge too far for your organization. So being able to estimate that and determine if that is too much for your organization is highly important. The other side of that, and I don't know that I've seen this too much, if I'm being completely honest, but the other side of that is thinking, again, a lot of this is coming from incident response. The thing that I haven't seen too much of is people pulling backups out of the cloud at the time of an incident and putting them onto Metal locally. I've seen more people convert backups to VMs in the cloud rather than pulling them out of the cloud. And so far, the reason I think that I've seen that primarily is because there is not just a cost, there's a cost of time to pulling that data out of the cloud. There's also, again, I'm going to go back to what I said about workstations and servers. The hardware that's associated with an incident is often retained as evidence for at least a period of time. Do you have hardware that you can pull those backups onto out of the cloud in the event that you have an incident? Or are you going to have to order that? What is your lead time on ordering that hardware? Is it 3 weeks? That goes into your RTO. Is that going to, is that amount of time, is that lead time acceptable to your organization to even begin recovery? I did get to sit on an incident where that was actually I did. I got to sit on an incident where that actually did happen, where we did have to actually order hardware, and I believe we ended up taking whatever a disti had on hand, and we used that because we could get it in 3 days. So, I mean, there are options, but if you're looking to get highly customized, God forbid we need any sort of GPU or any sort of specialized compute for any sort of, there's that word I'm blanking on again. VMware Horizons is a VDI. There we go. Found it. Another 3-letter acronym. I know of a couple customers that we have that use VDI, and getting those GPUs so that they could actually spin up their environment in one of these scenarios that'd be pretty difficult. GPUs are still at a premium to find, especially for the type of GPUs that they need. So again, the hardware goes into that question of what is our RTO for if we're just using backup stored in the cloud and pulling those back down to local hardware. Best is backup plus warm site. This is where it gets more expensive. This is actually building out replicas of your local machines in a cloud space, specifically cloud. The idea behind this is that you shouldn't necessarily, depending on the vendor you're using, you shouldn't necessarily have to pay for those resources because those machines will be in an offline state. They'll be updated depending on what solution you're using, but they'll be updated fairly regularly. They're ready for you to spin up at a moment's notice. This is probably the most reasonably close to zero that I have, to be honest, architected with our types of clients. This is basically a cloud-based warm site where you would actually be able to store those replicas and in the event of a disaster, spin those up. That allows you to have a firewall that's there. It might be the same brand of firewall used locally so that you have some easier failover ability. I touched on it, but the plus here is that technically all you're paying for while those machines are off is just the storage to retain those. So we've actually done this a number of times across our customer base where we've actually built out warm sites, with virtual machines in them where the only cost is, there's a couple recurring costs, but really the only real cost is the cost of the actual storage that those replicas are consuming. In this scenario, we would also want to build out symmetrical replication and failback. So one of the things that I didn't even touch on in those other slides is what does your failback look like? Are you able to recreate your virtual machines out of the cloud back on-prem and then fail back over to them, or is your failback completely offline? You got to copy those disks. So the other plus here is being able to build that symmetrical failback operations. That means that all of those blocks that you're creating while you're in disaster are still being written to those virtual machines, which then can be written back to not necessarily the original hardware the virtual machines came from, but it can go back to another piece of hardware. Let's just say that those are kept for evidence for 6 months, 3 months, not unreasonable, seen it happen. You have other hardware, you rebuild your infrastructure, now you can fail back to that hardware. That, again, helps inform your recovery time objective, because at the end of your disaster, are you going to create another disaster as you wait a week for everything to come back out of the cloud? So these are all conversations that I've had numerous times over the years. I said it earlier, but when I first started my career, I really did not want to play with backups. I didn't find them glamorous. I didn't like it. It made me nervous. And now I kind of feel like I specialize in it to some degree. Yeah, any questions so far? Is this all new-ish ground, or am I just telling you things you already knew? All right, so the title of this is, it involves our managed services. So where does Smart come in this? And this is HiPoint's play. We tailor these solutions to your needs. You can see there's several options, several different pieces that we can mix and match from to provide a solution that works for you. Our services are designed to not replace you. They're not designed to replace your IT staff. They're designed to augment your staff. We intend to come alongside and help out. We want to make sure that you guys are supported. We know that there can be difficulties finding specific skill sets. I lead a team of highly technical and specifically trained engineers that actually specialize in backup, disaster recovery, et cetera. So we are equipped to have those conversations to help inform your organization on what risk you guys may need to have, or what your risk appetite may be, and then help design a solution based on what your risk appetite is. We can do just implementation, that's our professional services side, or we can do ongoing management. We have a lot of customers that do both. Again, I can't really stress it enough. I feel like, I was an internal IT director for a long time, and back in the day, I was highly resistant to letting an MSP come in and help take over things, because my fear was that they were just going to figure out how to replace me. And that is something that I've really very much enjoyed being at HiPoCON, is we've never intended or participated in the replacement or displacement of IT staff. We are simply here for augmentation. So, yeah. One thing I did not touch on here is M365 backup. People think that your data is in Microsoft's cloud, it's therefore safe. If you look at your terms and conditions, Microsoft does not guarantee you that data. They don't guarantee that data will be available. They don't guarantee it will be accessible, and they don't guarantee they back it up. So I think that as you have a conversation, or as you think through what your organization's risk appetite is for local infrastructure, for server infrastructure, you probably also need to think through what your risk appetite is for data that you've now moved to Microsoft. It was the shared drive, now it's in SharePoint. Does that mean it's not needed? You don't need backups on it anymore, or does that mean that you just need to change your backup strategy?